So the first kind of dramatic speech that I want to talk about is maybe the most obvious, and this is dialogue. By the way, di means two, right? So dialogue refers to speech between two or more characters. Basically, it means conversation. Right? By the way, here is a scene from the new Michael Fassbender movie adaptation of Macbeth, which has been really critically acclaimed, and I would encourage you to watch. Here we have Macbeth speaking to Lady Macbeth, right? He's holding her stomach, which, again, I mentioned before that kind of something they choose to develop thematically in this movie adaptation is the childlessness of Lady Macbeth and the fact that their child has died, right? So perhaps his holding her stomach is like a paternal gesture, which relates to a hope of her to become pregnant and to give him a line of kings to make sure that he can undo the part of the prophecy that suggests that Banquo will give birth to a line of kings. But in any case, this is a moment of dialogue in the play and in the movie adaptation. And when we're analyzing dialogue, there are a number of questions that we should ask ourselves. One of the first things we should ask ourselves is, are the characters speaking in private or in public? What do Lady Macbeth and Macbeth talk about most often? Murdering Duncan. Is that something that they can talk about in public? Definitely not. Is it something that they talk about in private? It most definitely is. So, how does the nature of speech and the content of speech change based on who's listening? That's a really important question to ask. Secondly, does one character share any important information or secrets with the other? Right? A lot of times in Macbeth, when two characters are speaking, they're sharing information with each other that is privileged information and that they wouldn't want just anyone to hear. An example is the conversation that happens among some of the Scottish noblemen when they're talking about Macbeth. There are scenes throughout the play when two noblemen talk about how things aren't going so well with Macbeth as king, how Malcolm is at the court of the English King Edward seeking support to overthrow Macbeth. These are private conversations where secrets are shared and we learn a lot about the characters. Thirdly, who dominates the dialogue? This is a really important one. Sometimes you can simply count who spoke more lines, Lady Macbeth or Macbeth. And the answer to that question is going to tell you who's dominating the conversation, who's exerting power through their speech. In the later part of Act 1, we definitely see Lady Macbeth dominating Macbeth in moments of conversation or of dialogue. Okay? And when you look at how much more Lady Macbeth speaks, you can see that she's almost talking over her husband as she convinces him to murder Duncan. So, let's go ahead and let's take a look at a key moment of dialogue that happens right after the murder of Duncan. So, this occurs in Act 2, Scene 2, lines 13 through 20. We can take a look. We have two characters speaking to one another. We have Macbeth entering. By the way, this is a stage direction. And this is right after the murder, and Lady Macbeth says, "My husband," and Macbeth says, "I have done the deed." What is the deed? Of course, it's the murder of the king. Another instance of Macbeth not saying the word murder, but rather alluding to it with a pronoun, or here a more ambiguous noun, the deed. Okay? "Didst thou not hear a noise?" Lady Macbeth says, "I heard the owl scream and the crickets cry. Did not you speak? When? Now? As I descended? I." Okay, so let's pause. First of all, I means yes. Hark means pay attention or look out. One thing that I think is interesting about this moment of dialogue in Macbeth is that it's very fragmented. And quick-paced. One of the ways that Shakespeare's Macbeth has such a palpable and visceral impact on the audience is because action happens not only very dramatically and very violently, but very quickly. First, Duncan is murdered in the early stages of Act 2, which is relatively early for such a big death to occur in one of these plays. Next, Banquo's killed. Next, Lady Macduff and Macduff's son are killed. We have 2 prophecies. This all happens very quickly. So the fact that they're speaking in one-word sentences, or, a few-word sentences, makes the pacing of the drama very fast. Another thing that's interesting is that normally lines of speech are in complete lines, right? Like what we see here, multiple syllables. But here we see Lady Macbeth's speech, Macbeth's speech, Lady Macbeth's speech, and Macbeth's speech together comprising one complete line of text. So we see their speech as very fragmented and broken into pieces. And I think that this represents the way that Macbeth and Lady Macbeth mentally and ethically fall to pieces after they conspire to kill the king. And in a sense, we could say that their fragmented speech foreshadows their fragmented mental state in the aftermath of the murder of King Duncan. A couple other notes I'll give here. We have another stage direction. Macbeth is looking at his hands. By the way, some of the stage directions in the text that we're using are actually added by the editor in order to make reading and staging Macbeth more accurate. And the fact that we have brackets around this stage direction indicates that Shakespeare himself may not have included this stage direction in the play when he wrote it. And a final note on this moment of dialogue between Macbeth and Lady Macbeth is that we are already seeing Macbeth begin to show that he's afraid. We're already seeing that character of the fearless general that the captain first describes to Duncan in Act 1 falling apart. He says, "This is a sorry sight," when he's looking at his hands. In other words, he's showing that he is beginning to regret the murder of Duncan. But Lady Macbeth replies saying, "A foolish thought." So Lady Macbeth, when she says a foolish thought, again, she's challenging her husband. She's calling him a fool for regretting killing Duncan. Okay, so we've just taken a look at dialogue or conversation. We learned that when you're tracking dialogue, you should ask yourself, who's listening? Is it public or private? You should ask yourself, who's speaking more lines? Who's dominating the conversation, right? And you should ask yourself, what secrets are being shared, possibly, between the two characters? Now we're going to move on to monologue. Now, di can mean 2, and mono means 1. So a monologue is an extended speech delivered by a single character, okay? In Shakespearean drama, we only call speeches monologues when there are other characters present on stage. When a character is alone giving a monologue or a long speech, we do not call it a monologue, we call it a soliloquy. So it's very important for you to be able to understand the difference between a soliloquy and a monologue. We're going to look at soliloquies a little bit later. Okay? One thing for you to keep in mind is that typically a monologue has a single unifying theme where one key idea is expressed by a character in front of other characters. And 3 important series of questions we can ask in order to better understand the significance of a monologue in Shakespeare are, who's delivering the monologue and who's listening, right? Who is speaking, and then who is the audience? Is it one other character or a group of characters? What is the speaker's purpose, right? What is the speaker trying to accomplish? You know, a key thing to ask here is the character lying, right? Is the character trying to present an idea on stage that's not the truth? If you ever read another Shakespearean tragedy called Othello, the antagonist Iago is famous for speaking in front of other characters and lying and tricking them, right? When in reality, his inner motives are totally different from the motives he expresses through monologue to everyone else on stage. Finally, what is the theme that unifies the speaker's monologue? What is the idea or the purpose that all of the speech and all of the references in the monologue together work toward? Let's take a look at one moment of extended speech that I think we can call a monologue in Shakespeare's Macbeth. So here again, we have Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. This is in scene 7, the final scene of Act 1, lines 35 to 44. And I want to go ahead and say that some people might argue that this is not monologue, that it's dialogue. I'm going to make the argument that Lady Macbeth so dominates this discussion with Macbeth that her dialogue evolves into monologue, right? And her exchanges in this conversation become so lengthy and so thematically unified toward her purpose of trying to convince Macbeth to man up, so to speak, and kill the king, that it constitutes monologue and some of the most important monologues in the play. Let's go ahead and let's take a look. So Macbeth says, "We will proceed no further in this business." Again, Macbeth is not saying the word murder, but he's talking about murder. This business is the plan to kill Duncan. And again, the fact that he says this business, he's not saying specifically the plan to kill Duncan, could indicate that he's ashamed of this, or he almost doesn't even want to admit to himself that he's going to commit this terrible crime of regicide that is against God as much as it is against the state. He says, "He hath honored me of late." In other words, Duncan has honored him, has made him Thane of Cawdor, rewarded him for his prowess in battle. "I have bought golden opinions from all sorts of people." In other words, he has earned a good reputation, right? Sometimes people will tell us that a good reputation is priceless, right? If you have a good name, if people respect you, that's worth more than any amount of money. Well, what Macbeth means is that he's bought golden opinions. He has a good reputation as a loyal and brave general. Why would he waste that in murdering the king? And he says, "which would be worn now in their newest gloss, not cast aside so soon." So he's indicating that if he were to murder Duncan, he would cast aside the golden opinions. In other words, he would throw away the honor that he's earned on the battlefield. And we need to ask ourselves, is this a reasonable argument? And I think the answer is yes, right? If Macbeth were talking to me, I would be convinced. I would say, "You're right, Macbeth. Why kill the king? You do have a good reputation. You have been honored. You have been rewarded. Why don't you enjoy your life and keep working towards being the best Macbeth you can be rather than unnaturally and evilly killing the king?" But Lady Macbeth flips things around and she dominates the discussion. She speaks very strongly, and this is really the monologue that convinces Macbeth to go through with the crime and to kill Duncan, which is going to ultimately bring about his tragic conclusion. Lady Macbeth says, "Was the hope drunk wherein you dressed yourself? Hath it slept since?" So she's hope here we can probably gloss as ambition or goal. And of course, this is the ambition or goal to be king. And so she's asking, was your hope drunk? Right? When someone's drunk, you can't rely on what they're speaking to be the truth. They're not thinking carefully and meaning what they say. So she's asking rhetorically, almost, were you drunk when you told me you wanted to be king? What happened? She also uses the metaphor of dressing yourself in hope. So this is actually a motif that, M-O-T-I-F, that occurs a lot in Shakespeare's Macbeth. We're going to take a look at this in our next lesson. But what she means here is that, was your ambition just something that you dressed yourself in? In other words, was it only a disguise or an outward appearance? Or was it actually something real that you had in your heart? By the way, when a character asks a question and doesn't wait for an answer, it's a specific kind of device that we call a rhetorical question. Make sure you know this. It's a very common device in literature. Was the hope drunk wherein you dress yourself? Hath it slept since? And wakes it now to look so green and pale at what it did so freely? So she's battering her husband with these rhetorical questions. She's interrogating him and really verbally pummeling him into submission is one way we can read this monologue. She creates an image of Macbeth's hope or ambition getting drunk, falling asleep, and waking up green and pale. In other words, hungover and sick from too much drinking, right? And she's challenging him to commit to what he said and to follow in action what he's committed it to in deed. From this time, such I account thy love. Art thou afeared to be the same in thine own act and valor as thou art in desire? Are you afraid to be the same in act, and valor means courage, as you are in desire? So what is she doing? She's talking to the brave Macbeth, the fearless general who killed the traitor and whose sword smokes with bloody execution. And she's saying, are you afraid? Are you afraid to act according to your desires? And essentially, she's challenging his masculinity and challenging his courage, bullying him into going through with the deed. Wouldst thou have that which thou esteemest the ornament of life? So, would you have that which you consider, you esteem, or you hold the ornament of life? So in other words, would you have your kind of chief goal, which is the crown of Scotland, and live a coward in thine own esteem, letting I dare not wait upon I would, like the poor cat in the adage, right? So she's comparing him to like a poor cat, right? To a creature who isn't associated with courage. She's battering him with rhetorical questions. Everything we see in this monologue is a rhetorical question. She's interrogating him, and everything she says is unified by one common theme. Macbeth, are you brave enough to do what you really want to do, or are you such a coward that you're afraid to act on what you want? And ultimately, this monologue is going to be successful and is going to convince Macbeth to murder King Duncan and allow the rest of Shakespeare's Macbeth to take place according to the dramatic structure we spoke about in our last lesson. Soliloquy. Soliloquy. Soliloquy is the most important kind of dramatic speech in Shakespeare. Soliloquy is when a character speaks alone on stage. It's a device that Shakespeare has used more often and with greater effect than any other playwright that I've ever encountered. And oftentimes the most important moments in a Shakespearean play and the best writing, the best poetry takes place in a Shakespearean play in the soliloquy. Okay, so we talked about how die means two, mono means one. Well, SOL reminds us of solo, which means alone. A soliloquy refers to an extended speech or monologue delivered by a single character alone on stage. Okay? Soliloquy is important in a sense because it allows the character to speak freely since no one else is listening. The audience learns what the character is really thinking about and what the character really wants. Soliloquy also kind of takes the place of a narrator in a sense. If you've ever read a novel, especially a novel with a third-person omniscient narrator, the narrator is like the storyteller, right? The narrator often tells us what a character is thinking. For example, in Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, we have a third-person omniscient narrator who tells us about what the parents are thinking, what the daughters are thinking, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, everything they're worried about. Well, in a play, there's no one whispering in our ear what Macbeth is thinking, right? We can only see how they speak and how they behave on stage. So the soliloquy, in a sense, is like a device that allows the character to be their own narrator. When they're alone, they can say, ah, I'm so afraid. Ah, I'm so happy, right? They can let us know how they feel, what they're thinking, which gives their character greater depth and gives the audience greater understanding of what's going on stage. Okay, so when we are analyzing a soliloquy, we want to ask ourselves, who delivers the speech and what is the message? Secondly, what inner thoughts and motives does the speech reveal? Would the speaker reveal these in public? Right? Very important. Another thing I want to add is that really all dramatic speech in Shakespeare is full of rhetorical devices and oftentimes excellent poetry. And it seems to me that it's in the soliloquies that we find the best poetry in Shakespearean drama, right? In other words, it's not poetry, it's drama, but the language is so meaningful and so compact in the way it produces associations and meanings that it really rises to the height of the greatest poetry that we see in the sonnets in the words of someone like Hamlet, right? Or in this play, in the words of someone like Macbeth or Lady Macbeth. So let's go ahead and let's take a look at, what in my opinion is the most important soliloquy in Shakespeare's Macbeth. I imagine other people would have different opinions, maybe the dagger speech, maybe Lady Macbeth's speech in Act 1, but I think that this soliloquy in the first scene of Act 3, really where Macbeth decides that he's going to kill Banquo, which is really the decision that leads to the climax of the tragedy in my reading. I think that this soliloquy is incredibly important. And again, when Macbeth speaks these words, he's doing it alone on stage. Hence, it's a soliloquy. And he's really revealing information that he's keeping a secret from everyone else. For example, in Shakespeare's Macbeth, Lady Macbeth doesn't know Banquo will be murdered. And there's kind of like an interesting relationship between Macbeth and Lady Macbeth because when they're really close together, they're successful. When Lady Macbeth and Macbeth are sharing all their secrets with one another, even when Lady Macbeth seems to be kind of mean towards Macbeth, like in the dialogue we read a little bit earlier, they seem to be better together, stronger together. But when Macbeth starts keeping secrets from Lady Macbeth, this is kind of in parallel to Macbeth's downfall. This is when both of them start going a little bit crazy, becoming a little bit paranoid, and ultimately leads both of them to their death. Lady Macbeth by suicide and Macbeth by beheading at the hands of Macduff. Okay, so this is one of the first moments where Macbeth is keeping a secret from his wife. He hints that he might kill Banquo, but it's my reading that he never tells her decisively that he's going to kill Banquo. And here we see Macbeth reaching that conclusion. So he says, to be thus is nothing. Here, thus means this way. And what he means is king, right? He's already been crowned king. You would think that he's happy, but he says, to be thus, to be king is nothing, but to be safely thus. So what do we mean by this? Well, Macbeth is suffering from something we're going to investigate in depth later called the usurper's dilemma. Let's write this down. The usurper is someone who steals the throne from the rightful king, and a dilemma is kind of a problem or contradiction that a person faces. The usurper's dilemma is that I killed the king and now I'm king. But wait a second, if I killed the king, that means that someone might want to murder me. Right? And this is kind of the thought process that leads to Macbeth's paranoia. Right? So he says, I'm king, but that's nothing. I want to be safely king. That means I need to eliminate any threat that could take the crown away from me. And according to the witch's first prophecy, what's that first threat? It's the fact that Fleance, Banquo's son, is going to be the first of a line of kings culminating in James I, right, who's in the audience when this play is first staged. Okay, so Macbeth's kind of thinking this out and reasoning it out here. He says, our fears in Banquo stick deep. Okay? One thing that's important here is that he's using the first person plural. Traditionally, when a king spoke, he would have been speaking not just for himself, but for everyone in his country. So sometimes kings in Shakespeare and other texts will say not I and me, but we and us. So when he says our, he means he's speaking from the point of view of a king. He's using what's called the royal we. Okay? Our fears in Banquo stick deep, and in his royalty of nature reigns that which would be feared. So notice he's using these words royalty and reigns to describe Banquo. So the kind of vocabulary he's using reflects his chief fear that Banquo will be king, which of course aligns with the witch's first prophecy. 'Tis much he dares, and to that dauntless temper of his mind he hath a wisdom that doth guide his valor to act in safety. So A couple other words we see used to describe Banquo. It says, "'Tis much he dares." In other words, he's very daring, he's courageous. He's dauntless, which means fearless. And he hath a wisdom that doth guide his valor to act in safety. So we see three words, dauntless, dares, and valor, that are associated with courage, right? So Macbeth is afraid of how courageous Banquo is, and I think that this is hinting at the fact that Banquo might do what Macbeth did. He might try to fulfill the prophecy by killing Macbeth and putting his son Fleance and future generations in the position of King of Scotland. "There is none but he whose being I do fear." This becomes a little bit ironic later in the play, because whose being does he end up fearing later? Macduff's, right? "And under him my genius is rebuked, as it is said, Mark Antony's was by Caesar." This we call a historical allusion. In other words, a moment in a literary text when the text refers to a historical event. Mark Antony is a general under Julius Caesar, right? And he's kind of comparing his relationship with Banquo, the general, to Mark Antony's and Caesar's. Interestingly, Shakespeare explores this relationship in Antony and Cleopatra, one of his other tragedies. "He chid the sisters when first they put the name of king upon me, and bade them speak to him. Then prophet-like they hailed him, father to a line of kings." So here Macbeth is talking about him, Banquo, and the prophecy. Like prophets who see the future, they said that he would be father to a line of kings. And this is, in my opinion, the most interesting image in this soliloquy. Macbeth says, "Upon my head they placed a fruitless crown." Okay? So what does it mean for something to be fruitful versus fruitless? Okay, this kind of conjures up an image of like almost a tree, right? Like we can imagine an apple tree, right? And when an apple tree bears fruit, it means that it produces apples, right? And inside these apples are seeds, and when they fall to the ground, they're going to produce new apple trees. In other words, bearing fruit means producing the next generation. But Macbeth has no son, right? And the witches have prophesied that Banquo will be father to a line of kings. So therefore, his crown is fruitless. It will not bear fruit. It will not produce a next generation. He goes on to develop this image by saying that they've put a barren scepter in his grip, right? Gripe is grip. And barren means unable to produce children. "Thence to be wrenched with an unlineal hand, no son of mine succeeding." So it's an image of Macbeth with a crown with no fruit, a scepter, which is the staff that a king holds in his hand, that's barren, and then an unlineal hand, in other words, someone from outside his family, ripping the scepter from his hand, ripping the crown from his head, and giving the line of succession, giving the next generation of kings, not to Macbeth, but to Banquo. Okay, so really we see Macbeth really thinking deeply and being very afraid that the witch's prophecy is going to be fulfilled and Banquo's son will be king. And this is what really drives him to contract the murderers to kill Banquo and Fleance, which of course is a failure and brings about ultimately his tragic demise. We can see the rest of the soliloquy here. We can move on and notice a couple more important points. "For Banquo's issue have I filed my mind." Issue here means children. And filed means, we would say today, defiled. And to defile means to make dirty, to make terrible, to cover in smut and vulgar things. So he's saying that he's defiled his mind. In other words, by killing the king, he has doomed himself really to hell, right? Because he's gone against one of God's laws through the divine right of kings. And he is beginning to lose his mind. He's having trouble sleeping. He's becoming paranoid. So he's saying, if this is true, then I have destroyed my soul and destroyed my mind, not for my own son, but for Banquo's son. For them, the gracious Duncan, have I murdered, put rancors in the vessel of my peace only for them, and mine eternal jewel given to the common enemy of man. Mine eternal jewel here is a metaphor for his soul, right? According to the Christian worldview that Shakespeare would have kind of lived in, and Macbeth even pertains to some extent, the soul is eternal. After the body dies, the soul lives on. The soul either goes to heaven or to hell, right? So he's saying that I have given mine eternal jewel, my soul, to the common enemy of man, which is a euphemism for Satan or the devil, to make them kings, the seed of Banquo kings. Rather than so, come fate into the list, and champion me to the utterance, that they did wake each other. I stood, right? So basically, Macbeth is contemplating the second part of the witch's first prophecy, that Banquo's sons will be kings. He's thinking about how he's really destroyed himself, both his soul and his mind, in order to become king, but how fruitless that act will be if Banquo's sons go on to become kings. And through all of this, he's deciding to have Banquo murdered and Fleance murdered. A decision that ultimately the murderers bungle, and that leads to his tragic downfall. So I think this is a really important soliloquy, and it's important because Macbeth is revealing his truest feelings and thoughts to the audience, feelings he wouldn't reveal to anyone in public, not even his wife, Lady Macbeth. Okay, so we've talked about dialogue or conversation. We've talked about monologue, an extended speech by a single character, and we've talked about soliloquy, really the hallmark of Shakespearean dramatic speech, a speech alone on stage. Let's talk about a fourth kind of dramatic speech that is very interesting in its own right, even if it doesn't have the overall impact that soliloquy does. And this is called an aside. And let's actually introduce this by looking at a painting that we have here on the slide, Paul Bartel's An Aside in the Theater. So an aside is speech that is spoken in front of other characters, but it's not heard by them. In Shakespeare, an aside would be heard by the audience, but not by the other character. So in this scene here, we have a young woman, and there's an old man, and she is speaking to and looking at someone else who's outside the frame, right? And there's a kind of tension produced in this painting between the fact that this old man is not supposed to hear what she's saying, but he's so close that maybe he could hear it. It also creates a sense of intimacy between the audience and the subject of the painting, this woman, because this man isn't allowed to hear what she's saying, but we, the audience, we're like in on the joke. We can hear what she's saying. So sometimes in Shakespearean drama, a character will speak an aside. So maybe, I'll be Macbeth, Macduff is here, and then Macbeth will say something to the audience, and Macduff can't hear. So this creates a connection between the audience and Macbeth. It's almost like a momentary soliloquy because it allows the character to explain what's on his or her mind to the audience, and it creates this unique tension because the other characters can't hear it. So let's look at aside in Shakespeare. So aside refers to statements made in front of other characters, but heard only by the audience. I should say, sometimes some characters, right? Like Macbeth does an aside that only Banquo can hear in Act 1. Aside offers the audience access to privileged or special private information. And when analyzing an aside, we want to ask ourselves a couple of questions. First of all, what information is shared with the audience? What does the aside reveal about the character's reaction to events on stage? Oftentimes in Shakespeare, a character will learn something, right? For example, Macbeth learns that the murderer has failed to kill Fleance. We saw this earlier. And Macbeth does an aside. He says, the serpent is dead, but the worm who will in time breed venom still lives. Right? We analyzed this earlier. And so the murderer doesn't hear him, but the audience does. And the audience realizes, uh-oh, Macbeth is very worried now because the murder failed. Fleance lived, and now he has a reason for revenge. Okay, so let's look at a moment in Shakespeare's Macbeth where aside is used in a significant way. Okay, so here is the first important moment of aside in Shakespeare's Macbeth, and I think it's a really good example for us to look at because it's relatively simple in how it operates. And this is in Act 1, Scene 3, right after Macbeth and Banquo have learned the prophecy, right? And remember, at this point, Macbeth has no reason to believe that the prophecy is true. Okay, he has no reason to believe that what the witches said is true. So let's go ahead and let's see. Macbeth says, "The Thane of Cawdor lives. Why do you dress me in borrowed robes?" What's important to realize is that before Macbeth says this, Angus greets him as Thane of Cawdor. Right? Remember, Thane of Cawdor is a title of nobility. Thane is like Duke or some other title of nobility, and Cawdor is a place. Macbeth is already Thane of Glamis, but he's not yet Thane of Cawdor. Duncan has made him Thane of Cawdor earlier, but Macbeth doesn't know it yet because the audience has heard, but Macbeth has not. Right? So someone greets him as Thane of Cawdor, and Macbeth says, "The Thane of Cawdor lives. Why do you dress me in borrowed robes?" This is a metaphor. Right? So calling someone by someone else's name is kind of like dressing in robes that you borrow from someone else. So here, a name is metaphorically related to dress. Okay. And by the way, this is a very important motif we're going to look at in our next lesson. There's a famous essay on Macbeth by Miss Spurgeon. I forget her first name. This is her surname. And she really creates a catalog of all of the different instances of clothing being used metaphorically as a motif in Macbeth. We're going to look at it a little bit in our next lesson. But for now, he says, "Why do you call me Thane of Cawdor? I'm not Thane of Cawdor." Angus says, "Who was the Thane lives yet, but under heavy judgment bears that life which he deserves to lose." So Angus, remember, Angus is a Scottish nobleman. He has come from King Duncan, and he said that who was the Thane of Cawdor lives yet. In other words, still lives. But he is under heavy judgment, right? And he bears that life which he deserves to lose. What this basically means here is that the Thane of Cawdor will be executed. Remember, there were two traitors who rose up against Duncan. One of them Macbeth kills. He's smoked in bloody execution, is that term that the captain uses. But the other traitor is the Thane of Cawdor, who conspires to bring some enemy forces against Duncan. He was defeated too. And Macbeth doesn't know it yet, but the Thane of Cawdor has been sentenced to death for treachery, right? For treason, we might say. And Macbeth has been rewarded for his loyalty by being given the title of Thane of Cawdor. So he says, "Whether he was combined with those of Norway, or did line the rebel with hidden help and vantage, or that with both he labored in his country's wrack, I know not. But treason's capital, confessed and proved, have overthrown him." So treason is a crime that means to go against your own country. So the Thane of Cawdor, he conspired with Norway or another enemy to overthrow Duncan. Therefore, he committed treason. Treason is capital. A capital crime is the name of a crime, the punishment for which is death. So what Angus is saying is that the Thane of Cawdor is going to be executed, right? And you are the Thane of Cawdor. So Macbeth now does an aside. Notice this is in the stage directions. He says, "Glamis and Thane of Cawdor." So Macbeth is thinking to himself. He's realizing that the first part of the prophecy came true. When the witches called him Thane of Cawdor, he thought that they were making it up. But he just found out that he is going to be Thane of Cawdor. And now he's wondering, does that mean I'll also be King of Scotland? So we really see Macbeth's inner thoughts in this aside, right? He's not keeping it a secret because he has any murderous intentions yet, but he's kind of thinking to himself, and Shakespeare is externalizing Macbeth's thought process for the audience so that we in the audience, readers, have a better idea of how Macbeth is interpreting events. And again, this is part of the rising action. We can kind of see the gears turning, feel a little bit of tension as we too begin to wonder, wait a second, were the witches right? Is Macbeth going to become king? And this helps to set up the rest of the play's action. Okay, so in today's lesson, we talked about dramatic language. We learned that language operates in two ways. One, as speech of characters. Two, as stage directions. In Shakespeare, the speech of characters is more important. Most stage directions are implied. But if you read other drama like George Bernard Shaw, Tennessee Williams, Arthur Miller, etc., a lot of these modern 20th century, 21st century playwrights, they're going to use stage directions extensively. But in Shakespeare, we try to focus on dramatic speech. And there are four kinds of dramatic speech. We have dialogue or conversation, monologue, extended speech by a single character in front of others, soliloquy, speech alone on stage. This is the most important. And aside, a moment of speech to the audience that a character makes that other characters on stage don't hear. Okay? And a lot of times the stage directions let us know whether a soliloquy or an aside is happening because they tell us who's listening, who is present to hear the speech. So I'm Edward Dunnigan, partnering with the Bund Education. Thank you for watching this 5th section of our course on close reading Macbeth. I look forward to seeing you in our 6th section when we're going to be looking at some dramatic devices that operate in Macbeth. Thank you.